So one cluster of questions I got were about sort of trying to understand what intuitions are and what they're like. One person sort of generally asked, "What are intuitions?" And they put forward some suggestions. I think it's a really hard question in general, what intuitions are. But in philosophy, in this sort of debate, what we care about are intuitions as judgments about particular cases or situations that are immediate and for which our reasons aren't available to us. So these are, the Gettier case intuition is supposed to be a paradigmatic kind of particular judgment about a particular case. And that judgment, is immediate. We don't really know why we're making it. Somebody else asked, would things such as subliminal marketing, which causes an unconscious result in making you want the product through an unconscious process, would that also be considered an intuitive judgment? And I would say, well, marketing isn't a judgment itself, so subliminal marketing isn't an intuition. But subliminal marketing might cause us to make intuitive judgments about what we should buy or what's good or something like that. Somebody else says, it seems like intuitive judgments are linked to tacit biases and could be one or they could be related. So implicit biases, are they affecting our epistemological reasoning? And I think that's a great question. I think that's one way, maybe. It's not the words they use, but it's one way to think about what Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch are claiming, is that we have biases, maybe not necessarily bad or good biases, but biases based on the way we've been brought up, other things about our environment that might lead us to have different intuitive judgments. If that's right, then we should find Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch's results not very surprising. Somebody else suggests that they have the question about why people's intuitions might differ. They say, it seems that different intellectual ideas are imposed on people based on where they grow up. But perhaps we all have the same natural intuitions in the absence of these intellectual teachings. And perhaps the intellectual theories over the course of children's socialization come to adjust our natural intuition so that they're replaced by intuitions that are relative to one's culture. So if people were asked to strip away their intellectual convictions, maybe we would have more consistent intuitions across cultures. And so I think that might be something like the way philosophers have thought of it, that we all have these sort of intuitive judgments that we would make in common about the cases, many of the cases philosophers care about. But it's possible, I guess, that the way we're brought up, the intellectual climate in which we're brought up, the cultural climate, might change those intuitions, those intuitive judgments in certain ways. And so many philosophers, I think, go on thinking, well, that core of intuition that we share, that still comes out in these cases, while others are going to think, no, either there was no core to begin with, or the socialization process or the process of growing up in a particular culture and intellectual environment has changed whatever that core might have been. The final question that I want to discuss in this video, somebody asks about the judgment that epistemic relativism is an implausible view. Arguing against this, Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch say that different results for the rich and poor is a preposterous result. However, this your classmate asks, doesn't this denial of relativism rely on an intuition about the matter? The idea is that Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch are saying intuitively it would be preposterous if the rich and poor had different epistemic norms that applied to them. But it's important to keep in mind, and this goes back to the original discussion, that these aren't intuitions that philosophers are using. These aren't the kind of intuition we're talking about. So in the case described here, the things described are judgments about general principles, like a principle that says rich and poor have different epistemic norms or epistemic rules that apply to them. We might think that doesn't sound right, but that's not an intuition about a particular case in the way that philosophers generally use them. The way intuitions are generally used in philosophy is that they're judgments about particular cases. Think of Gettier cases. You're asked about a very specific scenario and asked to give your judgment about that. That's the intuitions philosophers are wanting to use. Whether they can depends on the Weinberg, Nichols, and Stitch discussion. Now, philosophers generally think that these intuitions about particular cases are things we have insight into, whereas what we think about general principles, we're not very good. So, for instance, if you just ask somebody on the street what to give a definition of knowledge, they'd be very hard pressed to. We don't have intuitive definitions of knowledge or intuitive thoughts about these general principles. But maybe if you ask them about a particular case, you describe a particular case to them where you just show them somebody saying something or doing something, you say, does that person know this? They'll be much better at having that judgment and getting it right. And those are the intuitions that philosophers are after.